Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. Like Kevin said, it is indeed a mouthful, and I even made the title a bigger mouthful. So today we're going to talk about best practices for delivering, sharing, and discovering content in the Power BI service. If you would like a copy of the slides that you are going to see today on my website, which is coatesdatastrategies.com or coatesds.com for short, /presentations. That's where you can find a PDF download of all of my presentations, this one included. So, like Kevin said, I'm Melissa Coates. I've been self-employed for almost 3 years now and been a trainer and consultant and all that good stuff for well, let's not say how many years, shall we? And these days I focus primarily on Power BI implementation, adoption, administration, all of those things that work around supporting the people that actually do the hands-on development work. And so I spend most of my time these days on two things. One is doing some technical writing for Microsoft. So if you've seen the Power BI adoption roadmap, that's me and Peter Myers and Matthew Roche. And we are hard at work on a whole new set of stuff that has only had the first little bit come out called Power BI implementation planning. So watch that space. I've also got an online course. So if you like today's session, go check it out. Here's what we're going to talk about today. I have this session broken down into three main areas: collaboration, distribution, and discovery. And I'm going to define those terms for you here in just a minute. I do want to emphasize that our focus really is on the Power BI service, things like delivering content over in the report server or embedding content in, say, a custom application. Those are all really important and really valid use cases, just not in scope for today's conversation. I am short 2 monitors today because I am lucky enough to have some hardware problems right before this session. So I am not going to see the chat. Kevin is going to help monitor if you have some questions, putting them in the chat. I will definitely stop at each one of these transition points. And if there's something really pressing, definitely feel free to jump in, Kevin, if you think we should handle it right that very moment.
Will do.
The other thing that I want to mention is that this session has a little bit of a, the angle that I'm approaching it on is, like we just said, collaboration, distribution, discovery, which is a little bit different frame of reference than a couple of other presentations that I have out there. So I wanted to mention that if you go to my presentations page and you find some other things, there's some other presentations that go further into certain topics that we're just going to touch on today. A little bit of overlap in content for sure, but some of these have different angles that we approach them from. So let me start first with just a bit of terminology so that you know what I mean as I go through some of these concepts. And when I say collaboration, really just a general term for people who are working together. So for instance, your data modeler, your report designer, the people that are doing QA and testing, because I know we all do that really thoroughly and really well. And a lot of times collaboration happens in desktop. We might be passing that PBIX file back and forth, but collaboration really also happens a lot in workspaces. And we'll talk more about that here in a minute. Distribution is the general term for I'm going to distribute or deliver content for other people to consume. We're usually referring to consumers only or those viewer only people, though it doesn't have to be. But the Power BI team, these terms, I did not make them up. The Power BI team, the way they see the world is distributing content for others to consume, which is a different thing to consider and plan for than the people that need to edit and maintain and publish content, like the people that need to collaborate together. Sharing is a loaded term. Now, sharing is an actual feature in the Power BI service, and we're going to talk about that some during this session. And it's one way to distribute content. Apps and viewing in workspaces are the other two in the Power BI service anyway. And when we say sharing, usually our intention is I'm going to give you some read-only permissions, but watch out for that if you're talking with people back at your office, because what they mean by sharing and what you mean by sharing might be a little bit different. And it's also sometimes referred to as the very specific feature and sometimes more just used in general. And I did that in the session title of this particular session that we're listening to right now. So watch out for that because it's one that can be really easily confused. Finally, data discovery. This is all about you might not have permission to go, for instance, view a report or a data set. You can see that that data set exists. You can see its metadata and you can request access to be able to access it. So we'll talk about the data hub in the third section.
Voilà, juste. Non, il parle papa.
If everybody
C'est moi la
can mute
chanson
themselves,
qu'il y a
that
dans-
would be great. So really, data discovery is all about helping people understand that data already exists. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can reuse existing data, which is one of my favorite topics because I come from that background of data warehousing and centralized business intelligence. So it's one of the great ways that we can help bridge self-service and what can end up being a little chaotic with a ton of duplication of effort and duplication of data, and bridge that gap between those worlds. So those are the 4 key terms that you need to know. Let's start talking first about collaboration. And here really we're focusing our conversation primarily on workspaces. So let's start with what is the purpose of a workspace? And first and foremost, sure, we want to store our content, but it's a lot more than that. The way I see it is the first and the primary purpose of a workspace is to help people collaborate on content. So the data model owner, the report owner, the tester, all that kind of stuff. That's our number one purpose. That is usually the people that are able to edit and publish content. Secondary purpose, you could do content distribution out of a workspace. So going back to that definition from a couple of minutes ago, that would be for our content viewers. When we have small teams and they don't need a bunch of extra overhead, we don't need to make it any harder than it needs to be. So if your boss, for instance, only needs view-only permission, the workspace is fine. That's okay. But that's a secondary purpose to workspace. That's not the primary use case for them. Whereas, for instance, the primary use case of an app is indeed content distribution, and we'll get to that conversation. A lot of things to consider when we are deciding how to organize our workspaces. What I'm showing you here are 2 data workspaces on the left. The one at the top left is got a data flow. The one at the bottom left is got a few data sets. And the one on the right is a reporting workspace. And the big reason that we want to think about this kind of thing is all about there's probably different people that need to collaborate on this content, meaning they need different security. When we do this, all those people that are going to be creating and publishing reports, they're not going to get to touch that data set. They could read that data. They can build new content from that data, but they can't overwrite it because we are setting ourselves up to support those different audiences and the people with different needs. Here's just an example. Across the top, I have 2 different data flows workspaces. The first one, the common data flows, might be used across a whole bunch of different use cases and audiences across the whole org. Then I've got maybe some accounting specific data flows at the top right. Bottom left, I've got a accounting transactions data set that is going to support reports in multiple workspaces at the bottom right. And this is really all about thinking We've got different scopes or topics, especially those reports down at the bottom right. We might have different people that are publishing that content. We might have different change management needs or different approval needs. And something like, for instance, using our 2 reporting workspaces at the bottom right, something like accounting month end might be a very informal workspace. So the people that are collaborating together, they're not trying to create beautiful reports. They might be just kind of ugly, but they get the job done and they all get in there and do what they need to do. Whereas something like accounting analytics, that report workspace might be much more formal. And that might be where the finalized numbers go. And perhaps everybody in the organization is able to view content from that particular workspace, probably via an app. So think about scope, topic, security, and change management needs, that kind of stuff when you're trying to figure out, well, how am I going to structure report and data workspaces to support collaboration and viewing when necessary. I could spend the entire hour of our session talking about workspace planning. I have a blog post about this on my website, so I'm going to let you go take a look at that if you would like. Really, this is just a short list of things to think about when doing workspace planning: collaboration, delivery scope, security, etc. So it's one of those things that seems super simple at the beginning, and it grows in complexity as you start to explore a lot of these different considerations. In terms of scope, here's where most people start. And some of you that are listening are going to have this. Somebody said, let's just set up Power BI workspaces that align with your org structure, 1 per department or team, however you're structured. That's okay for those small, little, informal workspaces, the ones that are really just collaborative, no need to make it harder than it needs to be. But you might outgrow that. And the thing is when you've got a workspace, you say, everything for our entire department is going to go in this one workspace. You might end up with a lot of unrelated content. Then you might find yourself starting to do more with individual item sharing instead of apps and workspace roles. That makes it tedious to secure, makes it a little more error prone as well when something needs to change. So I mentioned this just so you question when you're planning for a workspace, what should the scope really be? And it's possible the one for your department will work fine, but it's possible that that's not quite right. We also have multiple types of workspaces. You've heard me say data workspace, report workspace. Here I'm showing the data flow, the data set, and the report. And this gives us clarity on who might edit or view that content. Because a lot of times, especially if you get into the bigger organizations, different people are going to be responsible for these different types of artifacts. Means we're not over provisioning permissions. If we had all of this in one workspace and the people publishing reports just say, I promise I am not going to touch the data set, the data flow, the data mart, whatever, that might be fine. If so, okay. But if you have needs to make sure that the data layer is more protected than that, this can help. Then a very big deal if you need row level security to be invoked for these people that are creating reports in addition to the actual report viewers. This makes that happen because they don't have edit rights where the data set lives. Because if you haven't run into this yet, if you've got the data and the reports in the same workspace, you've got anything above viewer on the workspace, row level security is going to be ignored. So this can make that work as well. Again, helping facilitate collaboration, but in a secure way. And we're not trying to limit people. We want to let people get things done just in a way that's efficient and secure. So making it just as complicated as it needs to be to accomplish that, and hopefully no more so. So you've kind of heard me say this already. I'm going to say this basically a different way. If I've got the data up in its own workspace, like this sales data workspace here, the people that are allowed to author that data set would have a workspace role of this data workspace here only for admin member contributor. The people that need to create reports would get their own workspace role, but instead down here. And then they would also get what we call the build permission on the original data set. So, or the viewer role up on the data workspace as well, which implicitly grants build. That would be fine as well. That's assuming that they can view all of the content in the entire workspace. But build allows the report authors to create new content from the individual data set. So that's more than the viewer role. A lot of times we hear people talk about a shared data set, and lots of people call it something like a golden data set. And here's where we're talking about helping people collaborate, but in an efficient way, because they can reuse this data. This is basically showing I might have a Power BI report, a paginated report, an Excel report. They all connect to that data without duplicating it yet again. So if you have authors in your org that every Power BI report they create, they're importing data again, it's time to teach them that there's a better way to do this. There's also the fairly new, but still in public preview, idea of a direct query for a Power BI data set. A lot of people informally call that a composite model. Technically speaking, it's not a composite model until you add in another data source. But this would be a way to empower your data set creators to start with something if, say, 80% of what they need is already there, and then just go add in the extra pieces that they need. So these three here are targeting report creators, and this guy here is targeting data set creators, and then reports can be created from that as well. Certainly, more dependencies that start to exist like this, that means more and more things we need to put in place to protect this original data set, change management, etc. Now, you've heard me mention the build permission. If we have build on this original data set, we can create new reports from it. We can create a composite model. We can connect to it from the XMLA endpoint, and we can do analyze in Excel, which is basically the same thing as a live connection, just from Excel instead of from a report. So targeting your content creators. We can grant that build permission directly on the data set itself, or when we're sharing. So let me pop over for a second. Let's say, just want to make sure, because this is a really important thing for you to know. So let's say I just go to any old report here. Let me make this bigger. See it? If I go to this share button, and we're going to talk about this in a minute. This is a big red flag. We want to choose specific people instead. Guess what? Allow recipients to reshare is checked by default. And optionally, you can also allow people to build content with the data underneath the report. So that's what we mean when we say that build can be indirectly granted. It's just a convenience when you're sharing, when you're publishing in an app. Also, if you have the workspace role of contributor member admin, basically you're allowed to edit the content. Build just comes along for free, basically. So watch that and make sure that people in your organization that are publishing content understand when to actually grant build. rather than, checking it for everybody that gets viewer permissions, because the share itself on a report is targeting viewers. And then the build, of course, is targeting people that are going to create content. And those two audiences aren't always exactly the same. Now, I'm not going to talk about data marts a lot in this session, but they are the newest artifact type in the Power BI service. Let's say we create a data mart. It gets its companion data set that lives in direct query mode. What we end up with is not only the built-in data set where all the same stuff on the right side of the page here happens just like we talked about with a regular data set, but we also have this Azure SQL database that gets created, and we can use different query tools with it, meaning that those content creators can decide, gee, do I want to go after the relational data or do I want to go after the semantic model?
So Melissa, on the data sets themselves, after you share a data set, can the people change the data set?
Well, we need to talk about what sharing in a data mart or a data set really means. But the short and sweet answer, if I go to find a data set, and we are going to talk about sharing in more detail here in a second. If I just go to manage permissions for a data set, if we've got direct access, if they only have read permissions or read plus build, then no, they absolutely cannot change that data set. But down here are a couple people, for instance, that have member or admin, anything like that that is inherited from the workspace roles, those people can absolutely. So a share, and I hate to even say this right now because I'm gonna give you a different rule here in just a few minutes. A share is usually, historically, until data marts came along, intended to say we're going to give you read-only permissions to something and maybe build on a thing underneath it, right? But data marts have changed that just a little bit. And I'll elaborate on that here in just a couple minutes, if that's all right.
That's perfect.
Okay. So really, the build on a data mart really is the same idea, except you also get to connect to the SQL endpoint. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit more about how sharing is different on that data mart when we get to the next section. So for right now, just kind of know that it's mostly the same, but you also get to go decide, do I want to connect to the SQL data or the semantic model? And all these decisions totally are dependent on what are you really trying to accomplish? In the Power BI adoption roadmap, we talked about, well, what are our content ownership approaches? On the far right here, we have Enterprise BI. The data and the reports are all managed by some centralized team. And right, we did that. We've done that for decades. But I think everybody concurs that there's a time and a place for that. Enterprise BI is not dead, but it doesn't fit every possible use case anymore. So then there's the opposite of that, where business-led self-service BI, the business owns and manages all of their own data. And then there's a blend in the middle here, where you've got the data centralized and the reports can be created by whomever. And the one thing that I really want to mention here is that even in the adoption roadmap, we always say, if you're going to centralize the data, it's IT managing it or the BI team or the center of excellence. Here's the deal. you can follow this pattern of this managed self-service BI, the middle thing, even if you're doing business-led self-service BI. So on one hand, I like this kind of a graphic. On the other hand, I don't, because that middle is just a pattern. And if you teach people down in the operations department, for instance, how to do shared data sets, right? They're doing managed self-service BI. They just happen to own it end to end. So that's an important point, I think. With regard to Workspace, to wrap up this section, those 3 roles where you can edit content, those are the ones that are for collaboration. The viewer is really all about distribution for small teams. And really here, I just want to mention to watch out if you've got 40 different people that are an administrator on a workspace, that equates to risk. And if it's just a very casual, informal workspace without critical content, without certified content, I'm not going to worry about it as much as I am if you've got really critical content in that workspace that has expectations. Last note in this area, personal workspaces, we haven't talked about them. They have their place. What you don't want to do is store any mission critical content in a personal workspace. And really the standard workspaces are better for all of the things that we just spent, the last 15 minutes talking about. So let me pause there. Are there any questions in the chat that we want to tackle on the collaboration topic before I move on?
Nope. I think that my one question about the data set covered everything we had.
All right.
One question.
Yes.
With regards to the share, allowing all recipients to share, are there tenant settings that you can set to restrict that?
Yeah. Let me talk about sharing here in a second, because we're just about ready to start talking about distributing content, and sharing is one form of that. So if you'll allow me to kind of introduce the topic, when we go in and look at a couple things, there are a couple of tenant settings that are indeed very important, and one that I strongly recommend that you set.
Okay.
So if you'll hold that thought for me, thank you for mentioning that, so I'll make sure that I cover it.
Thank you.
So here, distributing content, we're really talking about apps, sharing, or workspace, and we're really focused on those viewers, whereas everything else we've talked about so far was really focused on the editors. When we need to view content, we have a number of different options. We have our 2 kinds of workspaces. We have an app, which is a collection of content from a standard workspace, or we have sharing, if in fact we want to say, I want to share one report, for example. If we take those 4 items and we say, well, what would the primary purpose of each one really be? That would be personal BI for my personal workspace. A standard workspace, we're talking about team collaboration or small team distribution, meaning absolutely use it for viewers if you have a small team, is all that really means. The app really begins to shine if you have broad content distribution. And the way it was explained to me by Wukash on the Power BI product team was, if you have people you don't work closely with in the organization, or you have really large numbers of people across the organization, that's where the app begins to really make a lot of sense. And then you've got the exceptions. And truly, I think of sharing as an exception to standard workspace security, because kind of like folders and files, right? On a file, you could break the folder level security and give different permissions. That's how to think about sharing, because it does something different than what the workspace roles do. And it has its place, and I'm going to give you a rule of thumb for when sharing does indeed have a good place. Starting with the simplest, just using a workspace for your viewers. You've heard me say this already. your people that work informally together, and they don't need to create an app. An app is great as a second layer, but we don't need it in every situation. With regard to the app, we can think of it as this packaged up set of related content. It's a huge reason why workspace planning is so important, is because one workspace has one app. The release plan has an item, by the way, if you haven't seen this, where you're going to be able to have different audiences for the app, to where if I have these 4 reports, but I want one set of people to see 3 of them, and I want the other people to see a different set, right? We're going to be able to do that soon according to the Power BI release plan. But the app is still kind of closely coupled with the workspace in that regard. It's the nicer experience for delivering content. We've got the really nice navigation. We can have links to documentation. We all love to do documentation for our solutions, right? Right? And it's just more usable and it's more friendly of a solution. So that's why we say it's more of a formal way of distributing content. Now, here's where we got to start watching out for some things. So we said the workspace and the app, kind of a one-to-one relationship. When we publish the app, we are picking up 2 things. We're picking up the content. So for instance, in this example, it's trying to say reports 1 and 2 had that little yes/no flag set to yes. So they're going to land in the app. But the app permissions go along with when this is published. So here's the deal. If you are messing around with report number 2 in the workspace and you're trying to get it just right, and you need to publish the app again because somebody new needs permissions, you've got yourself a problem. So using groups reduces that risk. So to kind of put what I just said a different way, when we have changes happening to reports and dashboards, the people that are only app viewers don't see those changes until the app is really republished. Data set changes happen immediately. And that's a really good thing for picking up, for instance, oh, a data refresh happened. Well, of course we want our app viewers to see that right away. But guess what? What also happens is you're making a schema change, or you're doing something that breaks the relationships, or something that the existing reports depend on. So it is possible to break the existing reports due to data set changes. So something to kind of watch out for. So your rule of thumb here, limit your workspace access to people that are your authors, your developers, your testers, all that kind of stuff. And then your app, that's your read-only consumers. And this really is just a rule of thumb, but it's a good mental place to start. And then from there, you can adjust to say, well, in this situation, we want to handle it a little bit differently because. All right, we've arrived at sharing. So before I do a demo, let me clarify sharing just a smidge because it's changed a lot in the last year. We've got links and we've got direct access. There are 3 kinds of links, which I'm going to show you here in a second. And then the direct access, there's just the one type. And the links came around because if you've shared content in Office or OneDrive or that sort of thing, the experience is now aligned with that in Power BI. So let me pop back over here, because this is some things are easier for me to explain with just diagrams that are conceptual. This one's easier to explain in a demo. If I click share on a report, and by the way, if you haven't already seen this in your organization, because sharing links, or the buttons I should say, are so prominently shown in the service, sharing ends up being reused a little bit too extensively in the org a lot of times, because people find it first before they find app permissions and before they know about workspace roles in a lot of cases. All right, so the first choice is people in your organization with the link can view and share. Guess what? That really is everyone in your organization. That also has a Power BI license. But guess what? This is a very, very aggressive setting. It is exactly like the other systems, but what you really want to do is adjust this in the tenant settings so that most people cannot do this by default. In my humble opinion, specific people should be the default. And if you turn this off in the tenant settings for other people, they won't even see it, and specific people will turn in to be the default. I'll show you that here in just a second. So if I were to choose specific people and I hit apply, then I can start adding my specific people. Let me get out of here for a second. And what I want to do is go to manage permissions. The other thing that's really important about links to know, those checkboxes we saw on that dialog a second ago where we could add a reshare, that one was on by default, or we could add a build and we would have had to have checked that. That's what influences the permissions that end up here. So here, I have two links, and if you can kind of see this, one guy has access to both. This gal only has access to this one, and then this user only has access to this one. So here's the deal. If I were to create a new link and I allowed read and build, what would actually happen is that person would just get added to this link. So the good news is we won't end up with hundreds and hundreds of links. That's the good news. Here's the interesting part. You might think that this link only works for this gal here because she's listed here. What I want you to be aware of is that this link would also work for her. And you want to know why? Because she can read and build. So guess what? Implicitly, this other link that only has read, that link, if she used it, will work for her too. So that's kind of nice from a user convenience perspective. It's just a little confusing at first. All right, now let me pop over to the tenant settings, and there's two of them. The big one that is really important to set is under the export and sharing settings section. And it's the one called allow shareable links to grant access to everyone in your organization. So I have in my demo tenant here, it's set to be Power BI share to entire organization. So that's a name of a group that's like, oh, right? Very, very descriptive. So that would make that behavior change. As an FYI, there's a second one that's similar. Restrict content with protected labels from being shared via a link with everyone in your organization. This one's in the information protection section. This one is going to behave more like, I go back over here, something like my highly restricted sensitivity label, which we don't have time to elaborate on that right now, but I have it set to be protected, which means it's encrypted, which means this label, if you don't have permission, you're not going to be able to share with everyone in the org. So that's a good one to set as well. But I kind of like setting the other one that's a little bit broader, not to limit people, just to save them. But the last thing I'll say about this right here, a good second layer of defense, if this is on and it needs to stay on, is row level security in your data set. If somebody has this link, they can open the report, but they don't have access to anything in row level security, the data itself will still be safe. All right, so sharing, I see sharing, since it works on one and only one item, as being good for informal scenarios, just a few of us. And so if I send it to Kevin to say, hey, I'm working on this, what do you think? That's a fine situation for sharing. If you, and since I'm running slightly out of time, if we have a situation where we have shared with the entire sales global organization, that's where I get a little bit more worried about sharing. So it's useful when you want to provide read-only access to one report or dashboard because they can't see everything in the workspace or they can't see everything in the app. And in that situation, sharing for reports or dashboards works. And like you heard me say earlier, I think of it as an exception to the workspace rule. Now, sharing for a data mart's a little bit different. Sharing of a data mart is not just the read-only with the optional build. Guess what? The ability to build on that data set that comes along with the data mart artifact comes along with sharing. So the data mart new kind of artifact has redefined what sharing can mean just a little bit. So if you share a data mart, they absolutely get to build content. It's not optional, at least for right now. We'll see if it changes. You get to connect to the SQL endpoint, and the reshare is still optional. So that makes it different because it's both read and build, and it's, at least for right now, it's direct access, not a link. So its default type of sharing is a little bit different than a report.
Melissa, we actually are going until 1:15 Eastern, so you have plenty of time.
That's perfect. Yeah, I was trying to leave about 15 minutes for Q&A, and I think we'll be close. So yeah, I'm trying to wrap up the formal discussion by about 1, and then with whatever time we have left that everybody has questions, we can handle the bulk of them then.
Okay, I didn't want you rushing.
Super.
Overly rushing.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. All right, so to wrap up this section, excuse me, just a few general rules or things to think about. No firm rules in any of this, right? But large teams and broad content distribution, that's where the app usually makes the most sense as a rule of thumb. Small teams, workspace or an app. Do you want the additional layer of the app, right? Do you want to have to republish stuff to the app when it's ready? Do you want to maintain the app permissions that are separate? It's a great benefit. Love that with apps. But for some small teams, they just might not need that extra overhead. And then sharing, perfect for certain individuals in certain circumstances. Your choice number 1, again, just a rule of thumb, but your choice number 1 is an app. Does that make a good choice for how we want to deliver content to our viewers? Choice number 2 is a workspace viewer. Choice number 3 is the individual item sharing. And here's the thing. I've seen so many people where the sharing is the first thing that they do. And so what I'd like to at least introduce is, can we think about it in the reverse? Because the app, the permissions are managed once for everything in the app. The workspace, the permissions are managed once for everything in the workspace. It's the sharing that gets more tedious. Now that tedious can be an advantage when you really do want an exception. It's just not a good thing to try to manage absolutely everything that way. This is the decision tree. You've heard this all from me already, essentially. So I'm going to go through this really fast. If we need to edit content, we need workspace permissions. If we have sort of official or formal content, we use an app. If we have collaborative content and they can see everything inside the workspace viewer, and if they only need to see one specific item, it's a sharing type of thing. So same thing you've heard me say, just a different way to look at it. I swiped this from the Enterprise Deployment White Paper, which incidentally, I'm in the middle of rewriting now, and it's being converted because it's over 2 years old now, the Enterprise Deployment White Paper is. So it's being converted into a new format as part of all of the new Power BI implementation planning guidance. Okay, we've got one last little bit. This is a smaller section than the two previous ones where we talk about discovering content. Any comments or questions that we want to handle before I do this last bit?
No, go for it.
Yeah. There is for sharing content, you have a specific person. Can that be a group?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And using a group is, whenever it makes sense to, is an absolute great thing to do. Just because, guess what, right? If there's 50 people in the group and that group gets to see a number of different things, you manage it all in one place. So absolutely love it. I just got done, and we talk about this in my course a lot. I can't even tell you how much management of groups comes up, but I just got done writing a bit for the new Power BI implementation stuff. And the thing is that using groups sounds simple at the beginning, but as soon as you start diving into it, it starts to expand in complexity. And what I mean by that is we say, okay, we've got a workspace and there are 4 roles to the workspace. So I need 4 groups, my admins, my members, etc. Oh, and I need a group for the app. Okay, great. So now I have 5 groups. Okay, what if we start splitting out my data and reporting workspaces? Oh, do I end up with 10 groups? Do I have separate dev, test, and prod? Oh, wow, do I get to 30 groups? Right? And we wouldn't normally really need to support all of those possible combinations, but that's a really good way to illustrate that once you start going down this road and creating Power BI specific groups for certain purposes, right? For certain audiences of people that could be 1 or more workspaces, it gets hairy fast.
Complex, yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, if you're sharing with a group or person, how do you see, and you allow them to share, how do you know who they've shared with?
Yeah, so there's a couple different things that you could do. So for instance, if I just want to go to the report and I go to manage permissions, I can see here's who the links have been shared with. So if I manage that, I can see that Ed and Stacy have, or Sadie have access to this first link, right? Or if we go over here to direct access, we see this here. But it really doesn't tell me. It just tells me the current state. It
Right.
doesn't tell me that, oh, it was Joe who provided access to Sadie via this sharing link. That I have to get out of the Power BI activity log. So for security auditing, there's essentially 2 general things that you want to do. One is you want to have all that activity log data, and that will tell you, oh, Joe shared this object with so-and-so on this day and time, right? All that kind of stuff. Same thing with workspace roles, same thing with publishing apps, etc. But then there's also the newest, best way to get this kind of data. They call it the scanner API, and it basically scans your workspaces and it gives you an inventory of, here's all of the things that are published in this workspace and what the security looks like. So it gives you a snapshot, kind of like this does, but you're pulling out that data instead of looking it up in a user interface. And so what I usually recommend is you pull that snapshot of your inventory and your security once a week or once a month, whatever makes sense. And then you've got that activity log to combine it with. Then you've got everything you need. Plus, you'll have to go over to Active Directory via Microsoft Graph or whichever way you attack it and get the members of the groups. So plenty of that kind of stuff to keep your admins busy.
Understood. Thank you very much.
Perfect. All right, so this last little bit is about discovering content. Way at the beginning, we talked about supporting all those people that are creating content, etc. How do they know what already exists? And what things should they be able to find exists? So this that you saw earlier, if we want to encourage people to use this sales data set, how do we encourage that? What usually happens? First, somebody just asks a colleague, where do I get such and such? And that'll always happen, absolutely. There's also the search functionality in Power BI, but guess what? That always relies on your user permissions. So if you don't already have access to a particular piece of content, search is not going to bring it back for you. Then there's the discovery experience in Power BI, the thing where we say, I can see that this thing exists, and then I can ask to try to get permission to it. Finally, there's the idea of a data catalog in the Microsoft world these days. That is Microsoft Purview. And so that would do more things that discovery in Power BI can do. But right now, for this conversation today, we'll just stop at level 3. So just sort of reiterate, search relies on your permissions. Discovery means that we're going to purposefully expose metadata to tell other people this thing exists. And it requires 2 things. One is the endorsement, so it has to be certified or promoted, and 2 is the discoverable setting. So let me show this conceptually for a second, and then I'm going to show you over in the Power BI service what this looks like. So here I've got 3 workspaces on the left. So let's say the sales data set, I've set it to be certified and I've set it to be discoverable. So it will show up in the data hub for other people to know this thing exists. Now we might treat financial data differently. We might say that that's certified. So subject to quality and change control. You know, I've got a whole bunch of stuff that you should be doing all this stuff if your content's certified, but that's beside the point for right now. But it's not discoverable. Financial data, maybe we have that tightly restricted to a much smaller number of people that are allowed to access that data set and recreate new content from it. The third one, my inventory data, that's actually a data mart plus its companion data set. And as it stands today, if you want to set it to be certified or discoverable, you actually set it on the data set itself, and it looks to me like the data mart just picks it up from there. So that's why I have them bracketed together over here. We'll see as the feature changes and grows. It's what, maybe a month old right now. So we'll see how that changes. In this respect, if we are going to ask for permission that you see something in the data hub, what's happening is they're asking for the build permission. So let me show you what this looks like for real. I'm going to go over here to the data hub. This thing, by the way, used to be called the data set hub. And with the introduction of data marts, it's been now rebranded as the data hub. Now, as it stands right now, discovery in Power BI only picks up the data layer. So it's targeted to your content creators, the people that want to go create a new report, or they want to create a new data set that starts with yours as a starting point. Hang on a second here. I need to, just a moment. I'm going to open a new window where I'm logged in as a different user, because I'd like to illustrate something. All right, so if I go to the properties for Okay, so starting with my user that's doing discovery, and then I'm going to back you into the properties. See how this one here and this one here are grayed out. The owner is hidden. And what happens when I hover right next to this is it says request access to work with this data. So my user here, if they filled this out, would be requesting build permissions on this data set. So how this is working, if I pop back over here for a second, and I go to my sales data workspace, I could have done that a little quicker from the data hub, but that's all right. And we go to the settings for the original data set. How we make this work is first, it has to be endorsed. So either promoted or certified. And then assuming that you have done one of those two things, you also check this box here to make discoverable. And that's exactly how we accomplish this experience right here. So what we'd like to see, for instance here, this little information button, I've got a nice little description. So what's in this? So if we're going to do data discovery, I go back to the settings of it just a little bit more, this little description here to help people figure out, is this really what I want? And should I bother asking for it? This becomes really, really crucial. All right, so that's actually it for the prepared material that I had. Let me put this up so if you want to grab, if you joined us a little later or anything, the slides that we just went through are here, plus a bunch of other stuff. So at this point, we can open it up to whatever questions we might still have.
All right. So first question, how do you move an item from my workspace to a shared workspace, or can you?
Well, there is an API actually to which one is it? There is an API to move it, to publish essentially, and you'd essentially be downloading it from the service and uploading it to the new destination. My best advice though is to always store your originals, your PBIX files in a really good safe place. I don't care if it's OneDrive, it could be SharePoint, something that's backed up. Regular file systems might be backed up. It might be much harder for you to go get yesterday's copy if you need to, that sort of thing. But a safe place where it's secured, and then if you wanted to just republish it to the new target, that would be the ideal. But there is an API to go grab it. Since it resides in someone's personal workspace, what we would need first, if I go to the release plan, there is a very interesting thing on the release plan. There it is, improve my workspace governance. If you currently treat your own personal workspace as, this is mine, nobody's ever going to see it, that won't always be true, because in the future, a Power BI service administrator is going to be able to add themselves to your personal workspace. I presume that's going to make it easier for them to call it API and go get that data. Because right now, before this lands, which by the way is, whoa, sorry about that. This is targeted to land in September. Sometimes these dates are right, sometimes they're not. So the current situation for my workspace and an admin API would be they can get metadata, right? But they don't have actual data access to access the data. They could get a list of the metadata of what's in your workspace. So long story short, keeping the original PBIX files somewhere safe so you can redeploy somewhere else is the top choice. You can always download, I guess, from the service as well. The ability to download and not have things get kooky is slowly but surely getting better.
All right. Next question.
Mhm.
What if you want to share, going back to your favorite comments before about sharing, what if you want to share to a group versus a specific person?
That would be okay. So if we want to do it with a link, this thing, even though it says specific people, you could absolutely use a group. So for instance, if I type in sales, here's a whole bunch of groups that exist in my org. So absolutely, it says specific people, but it picks up people and groups. Same thing for workspace roles, same thing for apps.
So is those groups within Power BI or within AD?
So these are all Azure Active Directory groups. Now there are some limitations if you're using a Microsoft 365 group. So for instance, that sharing, I wouldn't be able to use a Microsoft 365 group. It would have to be an actual security group, and it might originate in Active Directory and get synchronized up to Azure Active Directory. For Power BI's purposes, they just care that it got to Azure Active Directory somehow, whether it was created there or synchronized there. So my recommendation is always security groups is usually your first choice if you're talking about facilitating security, because you could use a security group for sharing apps and workspaces. It can be mail-enabled security group if you want it to be. That does mean that then you're managing it over an exchange. So you'd probably have to go get a different administrator. But the Microsoft 365 group does some things. It's just much more spotty in terms of its coverage across all of Power BI for what you can do with it. So that's great. The Microsoft 365 groups are great for, I want to set up a team to support my community of users, or that kind of stuff where it's more about communication, right? If it's about securing stuff, it's going to be spotty, and I would stay on the security group side. And distribution groups, those are the older style groups that were initially created for, you just need a distribution list for email. Those are supported, again, spotty in terms of its coverage, so it might or might not work depending on what you're trying to do. Usually those are created for one purpose, right? Some sort of communication purpose. So to turn around and use them now for securing stuff, if it does what you need, that's okay. Just kind of be a little bit careful.
Awesome. All right. Any tips for maintaining a report, maintaining the same report in different workspaces, therefore for different audiences?
Yes, I do. So I don't think I have a great demo of this. And I do have a slide, but it would take me a couple minutes to find it. So I'm going to explain this to you conceptually. Let me pop over here. If you have in your workspace, if you have ever seen this setting, which is a Workspace OneDrive, this is the thing I'm talking about. And this works sometimes. And if you follow Mike Carlo from Power BI Tips, he's got a blog post about this exact thing, and he is a big fan of doing this. So let's say if we start with our end goal, let's say I have 3 workspaces in the Power BI service that I need the same report in all 3 of them, right? We got a good reason why we want to duplicate the content. Okay, so how he proposes doing this, because he's the one that gave me this original idea a long time ago. So we've got our one and only PBIX, right? And let's say we drop it into a certain OneDrive location. That same location can be synchronized with more than one workspace. So when you're ready, you can almost use that OneDrive location like a drop zone, and then all 3 workspaces will synchronize with it and pick it up so that you're not publishing 3 different times. So it requires a little bit of discipline, and it requires people to know what the workflow is, but it's pretty cool.
Wow. Okay. So is it basically just like OneDrive for Power BI?
It's just a regular OneDrive, and the workspace has been told I can synchronize with files that exist there. So then it'll just do a refresh on its own. I haven't actually touched this in a very long time, so my details are a little bit fuzzy in my mind because it's been at least a year since I've played with it. But it is pretty cool.
Microsoft has probably made it better in the meantime too. So.
Exactly.
All right. All right. So future state, way future state in this case.
Uh-oh.
Will dashboards be phased out over time? And then if so, what are the best practices for when to publish via an app, a dashboard, or a report?
That I don't have any insight into at all. So the dashboards are a weird thing in Power BI, that's for sure. I don't lean on them heavily. I think the more you can stick with reports that do the job, and I know sometimes people call it's technically a report as far as an artifact type, but people call it the call center dashboard or whatever. I guess my recommendation would be to stick with reports where you can, or even the new metrics, because they're a little dashboardy kind of, but those are, definitely oriented towards, key performance indicators and goals and that kind of stuff. So a different thing. But if the dashboards do what you need, that's okay. They're just a web only artifact. So yeah, they're a different little animal. I don't have a strong recommendation.
Okay, then I think that is all of the questions that I've come into.
One additional.
Okay.
Are there any things that should be considered for sharing when you're using a gateway, enterprise gateway or Power BI gateway versus a personal gateway?
And when you say sharing in that regard, because, when you say it like that, I think, oh, those are just the viewers. So if you've got something that's running on a personal gateway and you're sharing it with others, as long as you know, yeah, if that laptop isn't running, or whatever, that there's a little bit of risk there. So I guess I wouldn't share content that's running off of a personal gateway, except in very informal, non-critical circumstances. If it's content running on a regular standard gateway, I wouldn't have any concerns about that at all. And incidentally, there's more the settings for controlling gateway and data source permissions got much more granular recently, which is really nice. So we have more flexibility of what to manage there. But that's more about if we're setting the permissions on, say, the data source. That's more about somebody saying, I can use that data source to refresh my own data set, as opposed to, I think your question was, I've already got the content running from that and I'm sharing it with other people. So different layers of security there.
Sure.
Not sure if I quite went the direction that I was supposed to with that thought.
Yeah, I think both the answers you gave covered, yeah,
Okay.
both scenarios I was thinking of. Yeah.
Okay.